Welcome everybody to this latest Frank Wright Memorial Lecture. It's a great privilege to introduce this lecture in honor of Frank Wright and to welcome his sister Claire once again, has come over from London for the lecture, I'm very pleased to say, along with, I can see a number of Frank's friends and also colleagues of the past are here as well. Frank died in 1993, almost 3 decades ago now. So many here will not have ever met Frank. But it's likely that directly or indirectly, you will have been influenced by his scholarship. 3 seminal pieces by Frank have left a permanent mark on the study of Northern Ireland. A journal article, 1973, Protestant Ideology and Politics in Ulster, and 2 books, Northern Ireland, A Comparative Analysis, 2 Lands on One Soil. That Frank had a major influence on anybody who knew him goes almost without saying. In addition to being a wonderful scholar, he was also a charismatic and inspiring teacher. They were different days then, but I can tell you that some of Frank's tutorials lasted rather longer than the scheduled time they were meant to last for, and nobody complained. But his influence extended far beyond his contemporaries to scholars who have never known him or never met him. And let me give a brief example. Tim Wilson's Frontiers of Violence, published in 2010. This is a study of Upper Silesia and Ulster after the First World War that draws its inspiration from Frank's analysis of ethnic frontiers in Eastern Europe and their similarities to the Irish case. Giving this year's lecture is a very distinguished scholar, Professor Jennifer Todd, who has written voluminously on the subject of Northern Ireland over the course of many years. Her books include, with Joseph Ruan, Dynamics of Conflict in Northern Ireland, and with John Coakley, Negotiating a Settlement in Northern Ireland, and Identity, Changes After Conflict, Ethnicity Boundaries, and Belonging in the 2 Islands, to mention just a few of her books. And there's a lot more to come from various projects that Jennifer has currently been working on that address challenges such as Brexit. She's also been responsible for the putting together of the John White Archive, which is a wonderful archive dealing with how a settlement was achieved in Northern Ireland. But while the main focus of Jennifer's work has been the 2 jurisdictions on this island, it is informed by a comparative perspective that gives a dimension to her work that extends far beyond Irish studies and has contributed to her international renown. In short, her scholarship has a lot in common with Frank Wright's, a lot in common in terms of her approach to the Irish question. Jennifer is thus superbly equipped to honor Frank's memory today. And for her lecture, she has chosen a subject very dear to Frank's heart: ethnic conflict, comparative logics, prospects of transformation. Okay, thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Adrian, and I want to start by thanking everyone who invited me, in particular the school and Stefan Andreasen, Adrian for commenting. And I much appreciate again the opportunity to engage with the work of Frank Wright. I met Frank in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, although I didn't know him well. He always made an impact, and engaging with his work is always intellectually productive. And of course, there's a sadness about discussing transformation at a time of European war. My talk, however, is about social transformation, and in particular the transformation of ethnic divisions and conflict It's about symbolic boundaries and social divisions as much as about territorial borders, the transformation of group division, not simply of state power, although the two are interrelated. And I give examples, extended examples from the island of Ireland, but with comparative intent, because I want to focus on the mechanisms that tend to reproduce division and conflict, even though most people don't want it. And this was a point that was central to Frank's work, and I want to try to expand some of the mechanisms. It's not intended to be an explanation of the proximate causes of problems here at this stage in Northern Ireland. In fact, I'm hardly going to mention Brexit at all. But I will be looking at cultural and social mechanisms that obstruct transformation, even in times of peace. And in particular, three. First, what I call group boundaries and groupness, in particular the ethical dimension of ethnic groupness. Second, normative dissonance, which I'll explain later. And third, cultural dispersal and political divergence. And because it's necessary to show their place in ethnic conflict, I'll also be discussing the spectrum of ethnic division from what Frank called ethnic frontiers to colonial conflicts. Now, transformation wasn't much discussed by Frank Wright in his really important book on comparative analysis, except to say that it was almost impossible, and certainly impossible by any gradual process of culture shift that's common in more tranquil, what he called more tranquil metropolitan societies. And I fully agree with that. For Frank, as I understand his work, any transformation came not from goodwill, but from, and he used Girard's work, the revolutionary violence that created a new socio-political founding moment by creating a new scapegoat. And it goes without saying that he didn't endorse that. It was an analytic point. Now, I want to return to some of these questions, making use of new theoretical, comparative, and empirical evidence. Theoretically and comparatively, I'm engaging with a set of thinkers for whom ethnicity and boundaries are matters, in part at least, of morality and meaning, from Sudhir Kakar to Daniel Bartal and Uriel Abeloff, and with the wider sociological and anthropological literature. And I'm also thinking with the Irish cases, which give us a solid quarter century of failed promises of transformation in times of peace, and give us a wealth of data for analysis. So I'm going to try to build my own research on the Irish cases with a more general intent. And to anticipate, I'm going to argue that, first, transformation of deep ethnic division is possible. Second, it's difficult even in times of peace, for reasons centered on ethics as much as on ethnicity. And third, to prevent misunderstanding, it follows from my argument that liberal consociational institutions aren't that important in promoting or hindering transformation. I'm not going to give a critique or a defense of consociationalism. I'm going to try to talk on what I think is a more foundational level of what reproduces ethnic division. So the first section of my talk is about transformation. And according to William Sewell, social transformation has three aspects. It requires, first of all, a dislocation of power. So first, there's a dislocation of power. Second, there's a relocation of meaning. So first power, second meaning, dislocation of power, relocation of meaning. Third, through events that crystallize the changes and institutionalize them. And the storming of the Bastille in the French Revolution is his famous example. What's of interest here is the analytic unity of the three dimensions in Sewell's thought. They're all different aspects of one process. It's precisely the coincidence of power dislocation, meaning relocation, and organizing events that makes social transformation so unusual. Power grabs, coups, partial shifts in ideas, reform and protest are quite common. Social transformation much less so. In contemporary thinking, transformative processes are understood temporally, a bit differently than Sewell did, I think. First of all, they're understood as incremental processes of incremental institutional change over time that dislocate power, not just sudden exogenous shocks, war, or economic crises, or so on. So people think of transformation in terms of incremental institutional change. Secondly, they think of it in terms of experiential as well as ideological relocation of meaning. They think in terms of new collective imaginaries and culture shifts more than group identity politics. And there's equally a focus on the democratic relocation of meaning, the gentle revolutions, the velvet and jasmine revolutions rather than the French or Russian revolutions. And finally, in contemporary thought, events and organization are seen as sequential rather than simply punctual. And in particular, contemporary democratic thinkers hope that slowly changing popular experience, the relocation of meaning at the level of experience, can sustain institutional change and allow it to proceed by voting rather than violence. And a whole set of theorists point out that if there's not change in actors' expectations and coordination practices, new institutions will revert to older modes of functioning, and constitutions will have a different impact than intended. Thus, the everyday relocation of meaning has come to the center of attention, and it's the key to my argument today, too. But 2 points are crucial. First of all, the everyday relocation of meaning is never sufficient for transformative change. James C. Scott, among others, has shown this thoroughly from many different angles. But secondly, if change is to be transformative, everyday relocation of meaning is necessary. Very little of this discussion of transformation centers on ethnically divided places. The dislocation of power has, in fact, got unexpected consequences in situations of group conflict. When state power implodes, group power takes over. The relocation of meaning isn't effective if group antagonism is about power, not meaning. And where ethnic conflict predominates, there's often a tendency analytically and politically to split the dimensions. So in one paradigm, people talk about dislocation of power and revolution, needing to dislodge the state, to delegitimize a given order. And the assumption is that Fanon's decolonization is an example. The assumption is that a relocation of meaning will follow the dislocation of power. Although, of course, that doesn't hold if the agents of change are one group opposed to others. And we can think of examples of this in Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland's a carnival of reaction after Brexit needs to press forward to United Ireland now, democratically, yes, but unionist resistance simply to be stopped. In another paradigm, relocation of meaning is centered on, is focused on, and people talk about reconciliation peace, real positive peace, not negative peace, as Galtung says, needs slow local work, contact, everyday change and reconciliation, what John Hume called spilling sweat, not blood. It's incremental, a sort of culture shift. So it's sometimes said a new middle ground is emerging in Northern Ireland as long as we don't engage in divisive talk of constitutional change. And the third, if number one is dislocation of power, number two is relocation of meaning. The third typical paradigm accepts that powerless dislocation and meaning relocation don't really work, and says the only realist option is to stabilize the present to make it tolerable in situations of ethnic conflict. Consociation is the best we can do. Good Friday Agreement brought stability and peace and needs to be copper-fastened as best as possible post-Brexit. For the Irish government, for example, constitutional change is too dangerous. There's a fear of a Bosnian situation. But, of course, stabilizing a divided society is itself a challenge for both geopolitical and internal reasons. It seems to me indicative of the limits of our thinking about divided societies that political responses so often veer to one or other view, either revolution or reconciliation or realism. A more integrated approach to transformation is possible. At least in principle, structural change, the dislocation of power, can fracture the links between experience and group identity, groupness, allowing new alliances to form and new events to crystallize them institutionally. If that's true in principle, in practice, it's more difficult. Collective experience, group ideology, and organizational networks tend to be out of phase. Agents of change are hard to find, and there's new problems. For example, social media short-circuit experience to the benefit of easily communicated identity politics. In divided societies, this means that steps to transformation are easily reversed, and it forces us to develop our thinking. In this paper, I'm going to focus particularly on meaning relocation. A few words about the Irish cases, in particular Northern Ireland. Thinking with the two Irish cases is always valuable because it stops us taking shortcuts. And it shows the major difficulties of relocating meaning, even in a benign case in Northern Ireland when violence has stopped. Now, there's at least two recent cases of transformative events in Northern Ireland. One was the civil rights movement, dislocated power, relocated meaning, through a whole series of events, although it collapsed into group conflict. The second could be the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement of 1998, which was potentially transformative, dislocating power and relocating meaning through a series of events: end of violence, negotiation, agreement, referenda, that it saw as giving the way for a new beginning. And just 3 points about this. First, the Good Friday Agreement set up a set of egalitarian institutions with sharing of power within Northern Ireland, institutional linkages between North and South, and strong equality and rights protections in Northern Ireland. This was at once a dislocation of power and a relocation of meaning. Secondly, it defined a new geopolitical context whereby Britain and Ireland guaranteed Northern Ireland as a distinctive egalitarian region open to the south, where British sovereignty and economic support no longer privileged unionism, and where change to a united Ireland would be by majority consent. This was now an interface periphery where different long-term aims could peacefully coexist. It was achieved not just by multi-party agreement in Northern Ireland, but centrally by British-Irish international agreement. The legitimacy of British sovereignty in Northern Ireland, logically then, was therefore framed and constrained by the broader agreement. Again, there's a dislocation of power and relocation of meaning, this time at the geopolitical level. And what this produced was very radical rethinking in Northern Ireland itself. My own research in the 2000s, in my 2018 book, showed very extensive identity rethinking, twice as much and more radical than in the Republic of Ireland at the time. This was also clear in the survey data. The numbers of pro-union Protestants who would find it almost impossible to accept a united Ireland declined to 14% in 2004-2006. To summarise, around 1998, the dislocation of power within Northern Ireland and geopolitically, together with the relocation of meaning embedded in new institutions, produced popular identity shift away from group division. But the outcome was unexpected. Transformation came in the Republic of Ireland, not in the North. Transformation in the South happened with the dislocation of power after the economic crash and the decline of the Catholic Church. This opened up two major referenda on marriage equality in 2015 and abortion in 2018, both passed. Symbolically, the Irish nation and state were now plural, no longer Catholic. Now, I don't want to overstate this. The transformation was internal to the 26 counties. It stretched rather than changed important national boundaries, and it didn't address North-South relations. It was nonetheless significant. In comparison, in Northern Ireland, there were reversals. Peace was maintained, but there was political stalemate and a breakdown of institutions of governance. Now, Brexit threatens to erode the compromise of the Good Friday Agreement, which has increasingly been questioned both by unionists and in London. Meanwhile, nationalists and Republicans are arguing for a referendum in Irish unity, as provided for in the Good Friday Agreement. Communal division has hardened again. Pro-union Protestants, who find a united Ireland impossible to accept, have increased threefold, now to about 41%. I looked recently at the views of unionist politicians whom I'd interviewed in 1998-99. Compared with today, they were enormously flexible. There's a startling hardening of language and discourse today. Brexit made the problems worse, but they were there since the end of 2012 at least. Thus, the island is a good place to explore how and why transformation happens or is stalled and stopped or reversed. Okay, my third section is back to the general boundaries, groupness, conflict, and the dynamics of thick and thin ethnic antagonism. Ethno-national division can be analysed as either thin or thick. It's thick when meaning and values are taken to affect the dynamics of division, and it's thin when they're not. Frank Wright usefully combines this analytic distinction with a historical distinction. On the one hand, if I'm reading him right, colonial relations are thick, with state-sponsored laws ensuring radical inequality and constituting binary divisions out of multiple parts. Group antagonism, thus, is intrinsically linked to lived experience in colonial situations. On the other hand, ethnic frontiers, and here we could think of Bosnia, the Balkans, Galicia, manifest a thinner form of ethnic conflict. Conflict becomes, he says, about everything and nothing. Group antagonism is independent of cultural content and even of lived experience outside of war and insecurity. I mean, this is a way, what later became, much later, became academic common sense in social identity theory and some forms of constructivism, but Frank developed this very early. On his analysis, in European ethnic frontiers, internal differences and inequalities may have much ameliorated, but it's the geopolitical shifts of great powers that give the opportunity for violence, that renews ethnic division and clarifies ethnic boundaries. So, for example, in Bosnia, the collapse of Yugoslavia created a power vacuum where armies clarified group boundaries, literally by killing anybody in an ambiguous position. Groupness came to overrule stateness, so that the state was seen only as the tool of the group. And Frank Wright outlined the mechanisms of violence by which group boundaries and borders are reproduced. For example, communal deterrence, threats to civilians deter the other side. Representative violence, any violence is taken as an attack on the whole group. The troublemaker veto, moderates and liberals try not to provoke the militants, and so they can't compromise. These are mechanisms whereby extremists can manipulate group antagonism and keep it on the boil, even though most people don't want it. And that's a crucially important contribution. As I say, on his analysis, transformation is almost impossible. Short of that, all that can be done is realistically to stabilize the situation best one can. For Frank Wright, as much later for Stathis Kalivas, who I think spoke here a few years ago, violent conflict in the ethnic frontier is constituted by opportunity and power and violence. Cultural meaning is unimportant. And the key dimension of variation in this type of analysis is violence and state constraint and violence. Bosnia is polarized by violence, Switzerland peaceful without it. But there's also, I would argue, a distinct dimension, counter dimension of groupness, to use Brubaker's term, which, for example, differentiates the ethnic frontiers of Bosnia and Alsace, where intense nation-state violence didn't provoke division. And by groupness, I'm going to focus here on a set of properties, in particular, the thickness or thinness of the content of ethnic division, and the clarity and consensus on its boundaries. The dimension of groupness can be seen very clearly in a set of complex conflicts with colonial origins. I'm thinking here of three: Algeria, Ukraine, and Northern Ireland, where group division was constituted out of a plurality of differences by the way state laws and institutions included and excluded different populations, and also by the ways the state formally and informally stabilized inequality. This created richly textured groups and contested and shifting group boundaries. As relations of power change, so too do relationships and self-conceptions. And there's at least three reasons why a concept of ethnic division as richly meaningful helps clarify dynamic relations in at least some sorts of conflict, by linking groupness with lived experience and focusing on intra-group, internal group fractures. First reason, power is linked with culture. horizontal inequality remains important in constituting difference and conflict, as Francis Stewart, Seldom and Wimmer and others have convincingly shown, long after colonialism ended. And at least in Stewart's conception of horizontal inequality, it's intrinsically linked to cultural capital, cultural resources, dominant value frames, and thus gives a capacity for recognition and agency. Horizontal inequality then is important not as empty power, but because of who the groups are. It's manifested in a specific relationship between culturally thick groups. Second, culturally, group oppositions in these and many, many other societies involve complex and contested boundaries where cultural and moral content matters. As Frederick Barth put it, basic value orientations, standards of morality and excellence help constitute boundaries. And these boundaries are renewed and revived by changing and contested criteria of who belongs and who doesn't belong, what it is to belong to the group. As Henry Hale and Onich recently argued, there's a family of characteristics relevant to being a Ukrainian as opposed to a Russian, not just one essential characteristics. It's exactly the same could be said about the Irish-British distinction in Northern Ireland, and even the Pied Noir Algerian distinction. This multiple family resemblance form of ethnic groupness allows for considerable liminality, negotiation, and change and flexibility while maintaining a continuity of boundaries. Third, over time, group dynamics varies with cultural content. Which criteria become dominant, among which subgroups, and how this impacts value understandings really affects how groups behave. To take the Irish case, the decline in the importance of Catholicism in Irish identity has opened up a whole range of options still to be explored. Now, of course, the thin concept of ethnic groupness in, for example, Calivas's argument, Calivas's point is a causal one. He argues we can explain the dynamics of conflict simply in terms of opportunity and violence. So, for example, violence in the Algerian War clarified divisions and even constituted one ethnic group. It constituted that archy from absolutely no distinctive cultural content. It's worth lingering a little bit on this argument because it shows how even the thinnest of ethnic groups opens up to content. So I want to say a few things about the archy. The archy are a descent group constituted in 1962 by French and Algerian ascription. The archy include a subset of those men of Algerian descent who worked and sometimes fought for the French in the Algerian War of Independence, and their families and descendants who neither worked nor fought for the French state in Algeria. At the time of French departure, and in a situation of internal Algerian conflict, some of those who worked or fought with the French changed sides. They went to the FLN, some were massacred, some returned safely to their villages, and some families, those who came to be known as the Arquis, fled the massacres and ended up incarcerated in camps in France, no longer permitted a visitor to be buried in Algeria. The Arquis, by this practical and discursive ascription of groupness, are constituted as an ethnic group by others, and as Calivas points out, significant numbers of them have in different ways assumed this identity. Ethnic groupness then is simply a product of power and opportunity, Perhaps, but the contingency of that key experience needs to be emphasized and interrogated. The French state was present throughout Algeria in the 1950s. It relocated whole villages for security reasons. Most Algerians were in close contact with it, and many men worked for it for a wide variety of reasons and with a wide range of relationships with the resistance. Some were FLN spies, some were reluctant helpers, and some were opportunists. The ascribed identity as Arki denies the contingency and complexity of these relationships. And in fact, it's still a very contentious identity. For example, in the south of France, where you find people yelling in public meetings about the position of the different groups, and in particular of the Arki. But in the contemporary period, the descendants of those who fled of the Arki, some of them are busy unpicking that ascription. And they unpick it precisely by taking a deep dive into meaning and value. The daughters of the Arki and granddaughters, and a whole set of playwrights, for example, from this background, are attempting to restore the plurality of different contingent stories, such that an implosion, destruction of Arki groupness can create a whole new sense of opportunities for those once caught in struggle. I linger on the story because it shows that even violence leaves radical contingencies, liminalities, and fractures between groupness and experience that allow for transformation and give the cultural resources for change. But that requires seeing ethnicity in relationship to experience. And so once we see ethnic groups and ethnic opposition also as thickly constituted, we can explore multiple mechanisms that help and hinder transformation. And I'm not here going to go into the section where I point out that in Ireland and indeed in the British Isles, both Irish and British are constituted, are group identities constituted by a family of overlapping criteria rather than any particular simple criteria. There's a variable geometry grammar of nationality for each, with a different politics associated with each way of opting in to the identity. Different politics, for example, from political Protestantism to pluralism, from Brexiteers to defeated Europeans. From this perspective, national identities and national oppositions are prime candidates for the relocation of meaning, defined by a family of characteristics, with some fading, some highlighting as practices and experiences change. They're not simply markers of an empty identity, they help constitute and manifest the boundaries which take on personal as well as political meaning. So not just Union versus United Ireland, but a way of life on every side that is valued, that has its symbols and practices which are attacked and destroyed by sectarians, and that has a history that's important. So, such disjunctures, what I'm trying to say here is that complex identities throw up constant disjunctures between experience and assumptions and identity politics. And these give personal incentives for change and cultural resources for the wider relocation of meaning. Okay then, if that's the case, what stops transformation? And my point in this almost final section of the paper is that there are cultural mechanisms that stop transformation, not simply violent mechanisms. So I'm trying to point out 3 additional mechanisms that slow and stop transformation. And we can see these by comparing processes of transformation in more consensual societies where complex identities give space for a slow-moving and generational relocation of meaning, and comparing this, and I'm taking the South as an example, with the obstacles to such generational gradual change in divided societies. Now, I'll begin with initial schema and then go to examples from each part of the island. So transformation and tranquility. I mean, we just need to read Engelhardt and people like that. Transformation and tranquility involves a relocation of meaning over generations, provoked by structural changes. Dislocations of power give opportunity for changing social practices, which go hand in hand with gradual change in ideas, values, and assumptions, valuing of autonomy, freedom of thought, etc. By the next generation, this change is magnified, clarified, and strengthened. What was hard work for generation 1 becomes common sense for generation 2, and even more for generation 3. They don't need to break networks of family or neighborhood, simply expand them, remaking tradition rather than rejecting it. That's a smooth process of culture shift. And I've argued elsewhere, but I'm not going to do the detail of it now. This took place in the Republic of Ireland since the 1950s, where you get the 3 generations. First slow change, then more radical critique of religion. And then by the 3rd generation of people now in their 20s and 30s, national and international, LGBTQ+, just common sense, radical, secularized, and arguing for change in the referenda, and able to achieve change in the referenda precisely because of the existing networks between the generations. So it's by mobilizing those networks that same-sex marriage equality passed by 2/3 and started at least an internal change in the South. Okay, and not every non-divided society can do this. The conditions, the gradual generational change has to take place within the national boundaries. Once it starts breaching important boundaries, as in Trump's America or as in Brexit Britain, you start to get division, you start to get breaches of networks, you start to get something like divided societies. And in divided societies, the important boundaries are breached very regularly. And that means that you can have major experiential shifts and disjunctures between groupness and experience in divided societies with only minor effects over time. Now, I want to make the point generally by pointing to 3 mechanisms that slow, stop, or stall the relocation of meaning, and then show how those 3 mechanisms worked in Northern Ireland. The 3 mechanisms. First one, we can call simply group constraints. Gradual change provoked by new opportunities and new modes of practice takes place normally within the ethical constraints of community boundaries, which define what it's appropriate to do or not to do, even when those boundaries are permeable, such change can't have the magnified effect on the next generation, because the new ideas, the new ways of thinking, are always also qualified by the boundary work. And so the next generation has to repeat the process of sifting out values from boundaries. And by the third generation, they see little of benefit from previous efforts, or they may. Change can still happen, but it's slow with reversals and new beginnings all over again, and seldom enough cumulative change to take advantage of new opportunities before there's new exogenous shocks like Brexit. Second mechanism I call normative dissonance. Think of the radicals, the people that start perhaps with new opportunities and new change, come up against communal constraints and meet them head on. Many are radical. They see the ethical constraints of the community and take them on in the name of their emerging experience and values. That's normative dissonance, and it gives rise to difficult moral challenges and breaches of existing networks and linkages. I think normative dissonance is an ever-present possibility if you've got a thick, complex ethno-national identity and structural changes which give rise to new practices and experiences. It's endemic in divided societies. It can be resolved only by refining one's individually, by refining one's intuitive values and principles to take account of more difficult and complex experiences. That's a difficult process requiring considerable cultural resources. It's not exactly Sudhir Kakar's in-depth psychoanalysis, but it's hard. So not everybody actually pushes forward to the end. And third mechanism, even when people do, there's problems for people that change more radically. First, there's vulnerability, so much so that some move back to the community for safety, beginning the cycle again. Second, there's great diversity, because people change from different communal backgrounds, class positions, and different local contexts. Lack of dense networks among them, or organisation, or even common projects, which could underlie new organisation. So central to my argument here is not some sort of backwardness or communityness in divided society. It's the boundaries, and I might go 6 minutes, not 5. It's that it's boundaries that stop, that make change difficult. Gradual consensual change, as in the Republic of Ireland, is possible only if you're not touching the important boundaries. So let me quickly expand with some evidence and data from Northern Ireland. First, recall, as I already noted, in Northern Ireland in the 2000s, after the Good Friday Agreement, there was massive rethinking. A full 2/3 of our interviewees, and there were many of them, were rethinking their identity in quite radical ways. That was twice as many as in the Republic. It's also shown in surveys, a decrease in hardliners in the 2000s. This massive experiential change met limits, and in the 2000s, going by our interviews, the limits were not so much ethnic or sectarian, but ethical. They were guarded not just by boundary police, but by internalized moral intuitions on key human issues like socializing of children or moral evil. And our respondents only saw these limits when they came into contact with them, when they had to change them. So one example, a forward-looking, thinking, culturally Catholic woman we interviewed had always assumed that a stable community upbringing was best for the children, for everyone, and then came face to face with her own moral disapproval of her own daughter, who went off and married a Free Presbyterian. The point being, well, change happens but slowly, with reversals, and important issues still to be tackled by each new generation. Second, such normative dissonance is endemic, and I've quasi-experimental evidence for this, which I insist on telling you, even if I go a little bit over. And that comes from mixed marriage interviews in Northern Ireland, in the south of Ireland, and in the Girard in France, where Protestant Catholic distinction is still important. I interviewed about 60 people in Protestant Catholic mixed marriages, about 20 in each of the situations, and the individuals were very, very similar to each other. They were similar in values, openness, total lack of ethnic solidarity. They were free movers and liberals who'd already escaped community ties, even before they married, so on. The difference, and it wasn't even that they had faced at this time real security problems in Northern Ireland. The ones we interviewed didn't. What they met was very different moral problems. Normative dissonance was something of an interest and even excitement in France, and couples explored and negotiated their different perspectives under a shared normative umbrella of Republican values or respect for minorities. In Northern Ireland, there was no umbrella. One typical example concerns the everyday upbringing of children. What one of our liberal respondents saw as a humane and kind education system, which she herself had benefited from, her husband, also liberal, saw as Catholic indoctrination. So these, there were no overarching values, or very few in the 2000s, and people had to invent or create their own overarching values. This led to crisis, weeks of anguish, despair, as they rethought some of their basic assumptions. They did so, lots of them did so, but it's hard, some of them fell back. Finally, even for those that have done this, there's still problems. And final bit of research, we know from the Northern Ireland Life and Times that a bit less than half the Northern Ireland population now distances from nationalism and unionism. And in an interview project in 2018 and 19, we set out to compare how people thought in two different local areas in Northern Ireland, one to the east of Belfast and one to the west of the Ban. We interviewed about 40 people, all of whom turned out to be these moderates, these middle ground people. But what was of interest was that they differed enormously. In the West, the moderates reached out for potential compromise with Sinn Féin and the DUP, or else they privatised from all politics. In the urban East, the moderates hardly encountered nationalists at all, much less Republicans, and they became radicals confronting the DUP, or cosmopolitans adopting British norms. Now, there's no political party or political project within Northern Ireland that encompasses them all. They don't even have a shared political language. They have few linkages with each other. They've diverse and subtle views that take time to explain, but they've difficulty linking into politics. And it's all the more difficult given the role of social media, which favours sound bites and identity politics rather than complex experiential argument. And that leads to a major disjuncture, and I'm in my last 2 pages, between constant experiential change and relatively little change in ethno-political division. Northern Ireland population presently divided in about half, between self-professed unionists and nationalists on the one hand, and those who distance themselves from the labels on the other. But those who distance themselves from the label sometimes vote for unionist or nationalist parties or don't vote at all. Thus, voting doesn't reflect the experiential change. It's roughly 40% unionist, 40% nationalist, 20% other. And even in what some see as the most hopeful scenarios for the next election, the main parties and blocs are likely to remain dominant. Okay, my argument in general is that there's a feedback pattern in divided societies that sets in motion a concertina effect, even in times of peace. Structural change, dislocation of power, new practices, and the resulting normative dissonance leads to an opening up of closed boundaries and borders. Renewed vulnerabilities again lead to closure, such that when exogenous opportunity opens, extremists are waiting and ready to mobilize support. This means that group antagonism and political conflict remain strong even when large sections of the population change. There's endogenous cultural mechanisms that give group division extra weight, even when lots of people don't want it to have it, and even when many people have changed in their views and hopes. And these mechanisms are first the spectrum of groupness and the ethical boundaries and ethical hurdles it puts in the way of generational change. Normative dissonance, the symbolic and moral boundaries that impede individual change. And dispersal and divergence, the difficulties of creating a shared project among those who have changed. Okay, on this analysis, relocation of meaning happens all the time, but on a social level, it's difficult to dovetail with the dislocation of power or with available actors and organizations. And the problem is prior to consociation. So, Frank Wright was correct, in my view, to emphasize the power of group antagonism, right, that waiting and avoiding difficult questions and hoping the middle ground grows isn't the answer. The counterforces are too strong. I think he may have underestimated the importance of content and value in ethnic dynamism. Once violence has ceased, that makes transformation possible. But, as I've tried to argue, extremely difficult. And I'm going to end now without having to try to say how we can get over these problems, which I'm not sure how.